You people always want more than you deserve." The words snapped through the boardroom like a whip. A senior executive, mid-50s, white, sharply dressed, slammed his palm on the table and pushed the proposal across with a grunt of disgust. Pages scattered. Coffee splashed. The interns froze. One even dropped her tablet. He stood tall, smug, looking directly at the man across the table. "Equity? You should be thankful we even considered you for this position." He didn't know. The man he'd just insulted wasn't pitching for the job. He was the one who owned the building. Every morning, before the glass walls caught the sun over Ridgeport's skyline, Elijah Freeman walked the 24th floor before anyone else arrived. Not because he had to, not because it was expected of CEO, but because he remembered when that floor didn't exist, back when his father leased a cramped space on South Haven Street and ran the operation with 4 phones, 1 fax machine, and a dream no one took seriously. Now, Harlan Equity Partners was one of the most influential investment groups in the Northwest, and Elijah was its second-generation leader. But no matter how high he climbed, the shadows of prove yourself never fully left his steps. Elijah wasn't born with a silver spoon, just a sharp mind and a mother who drilled purpose into every breath he took. His degrees, earned through scholarship and grit. His name, built through boardrooms where no one looked like him. And now, even with his name etched in brass on the door, some still assumed he was the diversity hire, or worse, the assistant. They didn't know he'd build internal systems that saved the company millions, or that he'd negotiated deals across 3 continents, or that the man they overlooked could recite every metric of the company's last 6 quarters faster than their VP of Finance. They only saw a black man in a suit and couldn't fathom that he might be the final voice in the room. The real battle, however, wasn't just for respect. It was for culture. Elijah had watched too many talented black employees rise fast, burn out faster. Microaggressions cloaked as jokes. Promotion paths that mysteriously ended. The burden of being the only one in a room full of echoes. So Elijah didn't just lead. He disrupted. He reviewed hiring pipelines, restructured mentorship programs, sat with entry-level analysts at lunch, and made inclusion more than a statement. It became infrastructure. He wasn't chasing diversity optics. He was rebuilding what power looked like from the inside out. And still, days like today reminded him, no matter how far he'd come, there were rooms where his authority was invisible, where his silence was mistaken for uncertainty, and his grace was interpreted as weakness. But Elijah wasn't there for approval. He was there to plant roots deep enough that the next young black professional wouldn't have to explain, prove, or shrink themselves just to breathe in a boardroom. Because this fight wasn't about one man's pride. It was about dismantling a ceiling so the whole building could rise. And as the morning sun finally poured into that 24th floor window, Elijah adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at the scattered pages on the floor, and said nothing. Yet, the first time it happened, Elijah didn't even flinch. A visiting partner from another firm had walked into the elevator with him and, without hesitation, asked Elijah which floor the mailroom was on. It wasn't the question itself. It was the ease with which it was asked, as if the finely tailored suit, the conference badge labeled Elijah Freeman CEO, and the air of quiet command meant nothing. The man didn't look at his face, just saw skin, and filled in the rest with his own assumptions. Elijah smiled, pressed the right button for him, and said nothing. But that moment stayed with him long after the elevator opened. It wasn't an isolated incident. In board meetings, he'd offer a suggestion and be met with silence, until someone else repeated the same idea with a new face and a new name. At shareholder gatherings, donors would address his white deputies first, assuming they held the power. And when Elijah pushed for equitable hiring practices, even the well-meaning ones questioned his objectivity. One executive behind closed doors had the audacity to say, "I just don't want us to lower the bar, you understand?" Elijah didn't respond, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood all too well. This wasn't just bias. It was a quiet system of suspicion, where his excellence was constantly put on trial, and his humanity was always being weighed against a shifting scale. What they didn't see was the invisible load Elijah carried into every room. The pressure to always be twice as good, twice as composed, twice as flawless, not for praise, but for permission, because one slip, one sharp word, one misstep, and he'd become the angry black CEO, a headline before he even left the room. And so, Elijah mastered the art of strategic silence. He let others take credit when it served the mission. He absorbed the awkward jokes. He corrected misstatements gently, diplomatically, even when they cut deep, because somewhere along the line, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to dismantle a wall was not with a hammer, but with patience, presence, and persistence. But behind the stoic gaze and steady tone, there were nights Elijah sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline, wondering how many more years he could carry this mantle. He wasn't just building a company, he was representing a community. Every decision he made was scrutinized, not just as a leader, but as a symbol, and that symbolism was a double-edged sword. Success felt like a responsibility, failure felt like betrayal, and even on days when the business thrived, when his team hit new milestones, there was always that lingering thought, am I doing enough for those who look like me? The system hadn't just given him power, it had given him a role he never asked for, to be the exception, the example, and the proof. All at once, Elijah knew the system wouldn't shift by simply existing within it. Change had to be engineered, so he began where it mattered most, at the hiring table. Every open position at Harlan Equity Partners now required anonymized resume reviews in the first round, eliminating names and schools that might trigger unconscious bias. The leadership team had scoffed at first. Isn't that a bit excessive? They asked. Elijah simply replied, not if we're serious. Within months, the candidate pool diversified, not because standards changed, but because bias barriers quietly fell. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the energy. The hallways sounded different, ideas sounded richer, and people no longer looked surprised when the room wasn't all the same shade. Then came the mentorship programs. Elijah refused to let the next generation of black professionals drift without guidance the way he had. Every junior hire was paired with 2 mentors, one within their department and another outside of it. He created a budget for shadowing days, executive lunches, career roadmaps. It wasn't performative, it was surgical, designed to interrupt the pattern of isolation and give these employees something the system rarely did: visibility and sponsorship. It wasn't just for black employees. Elijah expanded the model to elevate Latinx, Asian, LGBTQ+, and disabled professionals across departments. He wanted no one left behind, not on his watch. Of course, not everyone celebrated these moves. Whispers floated through the office. He's playing favorites. It's reverse discrimination. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the floor. Quarterly town halls became arenas of honesty. Employees shared stories of exclusion, of awkward moments never addressed, of opportunities that always seemed to pass them by. For the first time, those in power listened, not to defend but to understand. And through it all, Elijah stood not as a distant executive behind a podium, but as a man in the middle of the circle, sleeves rolled, eyes level, voice unwavering. This isn't about guilt, he told them. It's about accountability, about evolution, and about the future we say we want, but have to be brave enough to build. And build they did. Harlan Equity's internal DI council became a permanent fixture, staffed, funded, and empowered to audit everything from vendor relationships to leadership promotions. Elijah met monthly with them, not to manage but to listen. He invited external equity experts to challenge the leadership team, partnered with schools in underrepresented communities. created internship pipelines that didn't just check boxes but opened doors. The results spoke for themselves. Employee retention climbed, client satisfaction surged, and industry peers took notice. But to Elijah, the real victory wasn't in the metrics. It was in the hallway outside the executive suite, where a young analyst once approached him with tears in her eyes and said, "This is the first job where I felt I didn't have to hide who I am to succeed." That moment, that was the change he was fighting for. The shift wasn't immediate. It never is. But it was real. Over the next 2 years, Harlan Equity Partners transformed from a respected firm into a model for inclusive leadership. Other companies began sending their HR teams to shadow Elijah's DEI council. News outlets featured the firm in cover stories with titles like "The Quiet Revolution in Finance" and "Leadership That Looks Like Tomorrow." Elijah didn't chase the spotlight, but the spotlight came anyway. Awards, invitations, speaking panels, and yet he kept his focus narrow. People. Every new hire was still personally reviewed by him. Every mentorship pairing was still checked. Because for Elijah, systems meant nothing if the humans inside them weren't seen, supported, and heard. But the real legacy wasn't in magazine pages. It was in people's lives. One former intern, who once struggled to find her voice in meetings, was now leading her own fund in New York. Another junior analyst, a first-generation college grad, had just launched a fintech startup with support from Harlan's accelerator program. Dozens more were rising steadily across industries, carrying with them not just titles, but a new expectation of how leadership should look and feel. Elijah never asked for credit, but he felt it each time a young professional walked into a room, without flinching, without shrinking, as if their presence no longer needed explanation, as if the door had never been locked at all. Internally, the company's culture had evolved into something no metric could fully capture. Meetings began with check-ins. Birthdays were celebrated equally, regardless of title. Employees who had once felt invisible now led major initiatives. And while performance was still demanded, so was respect. One day, a senior partner caught himself interrupting a junior analyst and immediately apologized, unprompted. That wouldn't have happened 3 years ago. Elijah smiled when he heard about it, not because it was revolutionary, but because it was becoming normal. And when equity becomes the norm instead of the news, that's when a legacy begins to take root. Then came the real test. A proposed merger with a massive investment firm known for its profit-first culture and questionable hiring history. Their offer was tempting, lucrative, fast-tracked, guaranteed market expansion. The board was eager, but Elijah paused. He requested meetings with their HR heads, reviewed their internal reports, spoke to their junior employees anonymously, and what he found confirmed his instincts. The culture didn't align. At the final negotiation table, with both sides watching closely, Elijah stood and said, "We don't compromise who we are for who we could become. Not anymore." The room went silent. One of their VPs scoffed. You'd walk away from a $300 million deal over feelings. Elijah answered, calm and steady, not feelings, principles. Word of the rejected deal spread fast. Some called it foolish, others called it brave. But the response that mattered most came weeks later, when a group of junior associates from the rival firm quietly reached out. They asked for guidance, mentorship. Some even asked for jobs. "We've been watching," one of them said in an email. "Your team walks differently. We want to learn how." That line stayed with Elijah. Walks differently. Not louder. Not angrier. Just different. Grounded. Secure. The kind of leadership that no longer needed to shout to be heard. That was the legacy he was trying to build all along. And now, even those on the outside could feel it. And perhaps the most unexpected moment of all came at an industry gala. Elijah was being honored for transformational leadership in equity. As he stepped onto the stage, he spotted a familiar face in the front row. The very executive who once pushed away his proposal years ago, who threw the papers and sneered at the word equity. Now he was clapping, hesitantly, but clapping. After the ceremony, the man approached. "I didn't get it before," he admitted, "but I see it now. You weren't trying to change policy. You were changing people." Elijah nodded, smiled, and offered no lecture. Just one sentence. "That's how real power works. It doesn't force. It invites." That exchange wasn't revenge. It was proof that even the hardest hearts could shift when a legacy was undeniable. The office was quieter now. Late evenings had become Elijah's favorite hours, not for their solitude, but for the space they gave him to reflect. The conference room, once a battlefield of coded dismissals and silent wars, now held something different: gratitude, movement, growth. On the wall behind him hung a frame, not of his diplomas, but of a sticky note from his very first intern. It read, "Thanks for making me feel like I belong here." It was crooked. The handwriting was messy, but to Elijah, it was worth more than any degree, any plaque, because the real power of leadership, he come to understand, wasn't about being followed. It was about creating spaces where others could stand taller beside you. A week later, Elijah was invited to deliver the keynote at National Leadership Summit. The room was full of executives, investors, and policymakers. Many had never heard a black CEO speak without a script. Elijah stepped up, no notes in hand, just lived experience. He paused before speaking, letting the silence settle like dust before truth. "When I was younger," he began, "I thought the goal was to win the game, to play it better than anyone else, to get so good that they couldn't deny me a seat at the table. But what they don't tell you is, sometimes the table was never built with you in mind. A few heads shifted, a few eyes blinked." He continued, "So I stopped asking for a seat. I started asking, why can't we build a new table?" He shared stories, not of triumph, but of decisions, of walking away from easy deals because they compromised his values, of pushing forward mentorship even when it slowed quarterly returns, of telling the truth in rooms that punished honesty. Equity, he said, isn't charity, it's correction. It's the courage to admit the floor was tilted all along, and the will to level it, even if no one's watching. Some executives looked uncomfortable, others nodded slowly, but in that moment, something cracked, something rigid in the way they'd always thought business was supposed to be. Elijah wasn't asking for applause. He was offering a mirror, and he let the weight of that reflection speak louder than a mic ever could. Later that evening, as people milled about with drinks and applause faded into polite networking, a woman approached him, middle-aged, sharp suit, eyes tired. "My son just got passed over again," she said softly. "He's smart, quiet, doesn't play the game loud enough," they said. "I almost told him to give up." Elijah didn't offer advice, just asked her name, then said, "Tell him to keep showing up, even when it feels pointless, because somewhere, someone is watching him. Not for how loud he is, but for how steady he stands." That moment wasn't about business. It was about permission, about reminding everyday people that change doesn't require power, it requires persistence, and that every act of showing up, every time we choose fairness over comfort, we shift the ground beneath someone else's feet. In the months that followed, Elijah made fewer public appearances. He wasn't chasing more stages. He was investing in more people. Harlan's DI model was now being implemented in state school districts, small businesses, and even local government offices. Former men's became mentors, and though Elijah remained CEO, he often introduced himself simply as someone still learning. In his final words at the annual employee retreat, he didn't give a speech. He just stood in front of the team and said, "The world doesn't change because of titles. It changes when ordinary people make extraordinary choices, again and again." Then he stepped back, hands open, voice calm, and watched as others stepped forward to speak. That, more than any deal or headline, was the legacy he'd been building all along.